In the Mafia, money is supposed to end conversations. It ends arguments. It ends loyalty. And when it's large enough, it ends lives. So when a boss quietly approved $200,000 for one job, kill Lucky Luciano, nobody flinched. That wasn't emotion talking, that was arithmetic. At that price, there were no amateurs, no loose ends, no second chances. This wasn't a street hit. This wasn't revenge. It was a business decision. Lucky had become expensive to tolerate. Too connected. Too calm. Too good at surviving problems that should have buried him years earlier. For one boss in particular, negotiations were over. Influence hadn't worked. Pressure hadn't worked. So money was sent instead. The kind of money that guarantees obedience. The kind of money that doesn't come back. The payment moved cleanly. Counted, verified, delivered through trusted hands. No drama. No threats. Just an understanding. When this money disappears, so does Lucky Luciano. But days passed. Then something arrived. Not news, not confirmation, not a body. The money came back. The same bills, the same amount. Covered in blood. No message attached. No explanation offered. No request for more. In their world, that wasn't confusion. It was terror. Because returning blood-soaked money means one thing. The job didn't just fail. It reversed. Someone died, but not the intended target. Someone lost control, but not the man being hunted. And someone decided the only safe response was to send the payment back as proof they wanted no further part in this. That's not how contracts end. That's how warnings begin. The boss who paid understood immediately. This wasn't an insult. It wasn't defiance. It was worse. It meant Lucky Luciano had turned a paid execution into a lesson, one written in silence and blood. Who took the money? Who bled? And how did Lucky survive a contract designed to be airtight? Those questions spread fast. Faster than fear, faster than anger. Because once money stops working, everything else in that world becomes uncertain. And from that moment on, killing Lucky Luciano was no longer about price. It was about whether anyone was willing to risk becoming the next message. By the time the contract was written, Lucky Luciano wasn't just a rival. He was a blockage. Every expansion plan ran into him. Every alliance had to account for him. Every long-term play bent slightly off course because Lucky was still breathing. The boss who approved the $200,000 didn't do it in anger. That's important. Anger produces sloppy violence. This decision came after months of stalled negotiations, quiet pressure, and indirect warnings that went nowhere. Lucky didn't escalate, didn't threaten, didn't retreat. He just stayed in the way. And in the Mafia, men who can't be moved eventually get removed. The number mattered. $200,000 wasn't symbolic. It was strategic. It filtered out impulsive killers and pulled in specialists who worked clean, fast, and final. At that level, nobody asks questions. They ask for logistics. Routes, timing, confirmation. The boss paying the money believed three things. First, that Lucky's reputation had outgrown his actual defenses. Second, that distance and delegation had softened his edge. Third, that enough money collapses any remaining loyalty around a man. All three assumptions were wrong, but they sounded reasonable at the time. The payment didn't go directly to the shooters. That would have been careless. It moved through a broker, someone whose job was to insulate the buyer from the outcome. Middlemen like that survive by knowing who can deliver and who can't. This one was confident. He had history with Lucky's enemies. He had contacts who'd ended problems just as complicated. And he guaranteed discretion. No noise, no headlines, no fallout. The money changed hands in private, counted twice, sealed, and forwarded. From that point on, the boss did what bosses do when they think a problem is solved. He waited. No check-ins, no updates, no interference. That's how you know he expected success. Because when you pay that kind of price, you don't worry about whether the job gets done. You worry about what comes after. Except nothing happened. Lucky didn't disappear. No whispers of a funeral. No sudden power vacuum. At first, the silence felt procedural. Hits don't always announce themselves. But as days passed, the absence of confirmation became noticeable. Not alarming, just wrong. Then the package arrived. The boss didn't open it himself. He didn't need to. He already knew what it meant the moment he saw the wrapping. The money had come back, every bill accounted for, every stack intact, but soaked. Blood doesn't stain evenly. It pools, it clings. It turns currency into evidence. Whoever sent it back wanted the message unmistakable. This contract is dead, and so is someone else. The broker vanished immediately. Phones went unanswered. Doors stayed closed, and that told the boss everything he needed to know. The hit hadn't failed because of bad planning. It failed because Lucky Luciano had gotten to it before it reached him, and whatever happened next didn't just cancel the contract. It rewrote the cost of trying again. The mistake wasn't made on the night of the hit. It happened days earlier, quietly, invisibly, in the space where professionals assume they're safest. Between planning and execution. That's the gap Lucky always watched. The men hired for this job weren't reckless. They didn't brag. They didn't move loudly. They followed the rules that had kept them alive for years. Separate travel, no shared routines, no obvious surveillance. And still something shifted. Appointments moved without explanation. Contacts delayed callbacks. Information arrived just a little too late to be useful. At first, it felt like coincidence. But coincidence in their world is a warning system. And only the cautious survive long enough to recognize it. The shooters didn't know Lucky was aware of them. That's the key. If they had, they would have aborted immediately. Professionals don't force jobs once exposure is suspected. What they didn't understand was that Lucky didn't need names, faces, or locations. He needed patterns. A broker suddenly going quiet, a fixer rerouting communication, a safe address burning itself without explanation. Those are tells. Lucky had spent his life learning them. Not by hunting killers, but by watching how fear travels through intermediaries. When men who usually move money confidently start hesitating, it means pressure is being applied somewhere upstream. And pressure only comes from two places: law enforcement or a higher authority. This wasn't the police, which meant someone with reach had already touched the contract. Not to stop it, to reshape it. That's where the hit began to rot. One of the shooters noticed it first, a delay in equipment delivery that made no sense. Another flagged a sudden change in their exit option. Minor issues on paper, major risks in practice. They brought it up quietly. No panic, just concern. And concern spreads fast in small groups. Once doubt enters a crew, timing collapses. Every step gets reconsidered. Every decision feels heavier. Momentum bleeds out. They were still committed, but no longer confident. And confidence is what makes killers efficient. The broker tried to reassure them. Said everything was fine. Said the delay meant extra caution. Said Lucky was isolated, predictable, vulnerable. That last word landed wrong. Because men like Lucky are never vulnerable in the way others imagine. When vulnerability is advertised, it's usually manufactured. The shooters didn't call off the job, but they slowed it. And slowing a hit gives the target something priceless: time. By the time they realized they were being boxed in by uncertainty rather than force, it was too late to cleanly exit. Walking away would mean forfeiting the money and admitting fear. Proceeding meant risking something they couldn't yet define. That's when the first real error occurred. One of them reached out independently, not to Lucky, but to someone adjacent. A question asked too carefully. A confirmation requested too indirectly. Lucky never answered that call, but he didn't have to. The moment that line was crossed, the hit stopped being a straight line toward him. It became a loop, feeding back on itself, tightening, collapsing inward. What happened next didn't involve a confrontation. It involved a choice, and by the time the money was sent back covered in blood, that choice had already been made by someone who realized too late that killing Lucky Luciano was never the most dangerous part of the job. Understanding why you were hired was, the money didn't come back stained by accident. Blood doesn't end up on cash unless someone wants it there. That's what made the message so precise. The shooters never reached Lucky. That part mattered less than people assumed. The real failure happened inside the job itself when the chain of trust snapped and someone realized the only way out was to leave proof. It started with a confrontation that was never supposed to happen. Not between Lucky and the shooters, but among the shooters themselves. Once doubt entered the operation, hierarchy became unclear. One man wanted to push forward before exposure increased. Another wanted to pause and reassess. A third suspected the broker had misrepresented how close Lucky really was to the situation. Those disagreements weren't loud. They were surgical. Short conversations, tight voices, eyes checking reactions. And that's how crews fall apart. Not with arguments, but with misalignment. Someone made a call without approval. Someone withheld information. Someone decided their survival mattered more than the contract. By the time they regrouped, trust was gone. That's when Lucky's advantage fully materialized, because Lucky never needed to confront them directly. He let pressure do the work. Rumors filtered in from adjacent circles. Doors closed unexpectedly. A safe location was suddenly unavailable. A driver didn't show. Each disruption pushed the same question to the surface. Who else knows? That question kills cohesion faster than bullets. One of the shooters, the youngest, panicked first, not outwardly, internally. He realized that if Lucky was already shaping the environment, then finishing the job wouldn't end the danger. It would escalate it. And escalation was something none of them were insured against. The contract didn't include protection from what came next. That's when the argument turned physical. Not a firefight, not chaos. A single sudden act meant to silence a perceived liability. The blood wasn't Lucky's. It was internal. And once that line was crossed, the job was over. Killing Lucky had become irrelevant. Now the priority was containment, damage control, making sure the fallout didn't spread back to the people who had paid. That's why the money came back, not as a refund, but as evidence. Every bill accounted for meant the shooters weren't stealing. The blood meant they weren't negotiating. The silence meant they were done. Whoever survived that internal collapse understood the rules well enough to know one thing. Keeping the money would make them a target. For Lucky, for the broker's allies, and for the boss who'd paid. Returning it was the only move that closed all doors at once. It said, "We're finished. Don't look for us. Don't ask questions. And most importantly, this problem belongs to you now." When the boss received the package, he didn't demand explanations. He didn't send men to recover the loss. He didn't reissue the contract, because he recognized the signal. If a professional crew chooses to absorb a death, abandon a payday, and erase itself from circulation, it means they ran into something worse than a target. They ran into a system they couldn't see, couldn't predict, and couldn't survive twice. And at the center of that system was Lucky Luciano, untouched, exactly where he'd been the entire time. Waiting. The moment the money came back, the decision was already made. Not officially, not out loud, but internally the contract was dead. The boss who paid the $200,000 didn't react the way outsiders would expect. No rage, no retaliation, no frantic attempts to track down whoever survived. He didn't even ask for details, because asking questions would have meant admitting uncertainty. And uncertainty at that level is weakness. He understood the signal immediately. A professional crew had accepted a life-ending contract and walked away from it after losing one of their own. Not only walked away, they returned the money marked with proof that something had gone catastrophically wrong. That only happens when three lines are crossed at once. The target is aware, the environment is compromised, and escalation guarantees disaster. Reissuing the contract wouldn't fix any of that. It would announce desperation, and desperation invites predators. More importantly, the boss realized something else. Lucky didn't retaliate. There were no bodies dumped, no counter-hit, no warning delivered through violence. Lucky let the message speak for itself. That restraint was the most frightening part, because if Lucky had wanted revenge, the broker wouldn't have vanished quietly. He would have been found. If Lucky wanted to escalate, the boss would have felt pressure immediately. Instead, nothing happened. No follow-up, no reminder, no threat. Just silence. And silence, in that world, isn't neutral. It's deliberate. It forces the other side to replay events over and over, searching for angles they might have missed, dangers they didn't understand. The boss began seeing risk everywhere. Any new crew would ask why the last one disappeared. Any new broker would demand more insulation. Any delay would invite scrutiny. And scrutiny leads back to Lucky. Trying again wouldn't just be expensive. It would expose the boss's role in the first attempt. The blood-stained money ensured that. Whoever survived had severed all loyalty and all protection. If pushed, they'd talk. If threatened, they'd vanish. Either way, the risk had inverted. Lucky was no longer the liability. The attempt itself was. So the boss did what smart men do when a problem proves too dangerous to touch. He buried it. Territories were adjusted quietly. Old grievances softened. Attention drifted elsewhere. Lucky didn't gain new power from this. But he didn't need to. He gained something more valuable. Immunity from impulsive action. From that point forward, anyone proposing another hit on Lucky would be met with hesitation. Not because it was impossible, but because the last time someone tried, the outcome poisoned everyone involved. That's how reputations harden. Not through visible victories, but through invisible consequences. The $200,000 never bought a death. It bought a realization. Lucky Luciano wasn't a problem you solved with money. He was a problem that made money stop working. And once that truth settled in, nobody was eager to test it again. Especially the man who had already paid once and received nothing back but blood and silence. Years later, people would misunderstand that story. They'd say the hit failed. They'd say Lucky got lucky again. They'd say the shooters lost their nerve. All of that misses the point. The most important detail was never who died or who pulled back. It was what changed afterward. In the Mafia, money is supposed to be final. Once it's paid, events move in only one direction. You don't rewind contracts. You don't undo intent. You don't send cash back unless you're making a statement that words can't safely carry. And the statement wasn't "we couldn't do it." The statement was, "this target changes outcomes upstream." From that moment on, Lucky Luciano stopped being discussed as a man. He became a variable. Plans involving him needed extra time, extra buffers, extra deniability, and most importantly, extra courage. Because anyone proposing action against Lucky now had to explain something first. Why the last attempt collapsed so completely that even the money came home soaked in blood. That question killed momentum every time. It forced conversations to slow down. Forced men to admit they didn't fully understand the risk. Forced them to acknowledge that this wasn't just about pulling a trigger. It was about what happened before and after the trigger. Lucky never capitalized publicly on that incident. He didn't leak the story, didn't spread the rumor, didn't take credit. He let others do it for him. Because the men who saw that money knew something the rest of the underworld didn't. And fear spreads fastest when it comes from people who have no reason to exaggerate. Those men stopped taking similar contracts. Brokers became cautious around anything involving Lucky's name. Bosses started asking whether a problem really needed to be solved, or just managed. That's when Lucky's real protection locked in. Not bodyguards, not alliances, not territory. Reluctance. Reluctance to be the next one who tried and failed. Reluctance to explain why another crew disappeared. Reluctance to discover what Lucky already knew before you acted. The blood-stained money didn't make Lucky untouchable overnight. It made him expensive to challenge in ways nobody could budget for. And in organized crime, costs you can't calculate are the most dangerous kind. That's why the story survived. Not because of the violence, but because of the restraint. Because someone, somewhere in that chain, decided survival meant stepping away from both the money and the mission, and that decision echoed longer than any gunshot ever could. In the end, $200,000 didn't buy a murder. It bought a lesson every serious man in that world absorbed quietly. If money fails against someone once, you don't test it again, unless you're prepared to become part of the message. And nobody was. In the end, nothing about this story was loud. No headlines, no public retaliation, no bodies laid out as proof. Just money that came back when it never should have. In the underworld, that's the clearest verdict there is. Because when cash returns covered in blood, it means the system failed in the one place it's not allowed to fail. Someone paid, someone accepted, and somewhere in between, the rules broke. Lucky Luciano didn't need to announce victory. He didn't need to threaten the man who ordered the hit. He didn't even need to be seen. The message delivered itself. From that moment on, killing Lucky stopped being a question of price. It became a question of consequence. And consequences were suddenly impossible to predict. Every man involved understood that trying again wouldn't just risk failure. It would risk exposure. It would risk escalation no one could control. It would risk turning another private decision into a public warning. And in a world built on silence, warnings are deadly. Lucky survived not because he was untouchable, but because he made touching him dangerous in ways nobody could insure against. He turned a clean transaction into a contaminated one. He made professionals walk away from money they'd never walked away from before. That's real power, not the kind that fires first, the kind that makes others stop pulling the trigger. Years later, people would still argue about who ordered the hit, who died, and where the blood really came from. But the men who mattered never argued. They remembered. They remembered the money. They remembered the silence. and they remembered that some men don't need to win publicly to win permanently. Because when money fails, and nobody wants to try again, the war ends without ever being declared. And Lucky Luciano walked away, once more, not as the loudest man in the room, but as the one everyone decided was no longer worth testing.